I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you're holding a tiny ball bearing right in the palm of your hand.
Okay, like a standard metal ball bearing.
Yeah, exactly. Feel the weight of it. It's this completely unremarkable, perfectly spherical piece of steel, maybe about the size of a marble.
Right.
It's the exact kind of component you'd find inside basically any piece of heavy machinery. Like from the axle of a pickup truck to, I don't know, a factory conveyor belt.
Oh, for sure. They're everywhere.
Right. And if you were to walk down to your local hardware store right now, you could probably pick one up for, what, $15?
Yeah, maybe even less. It's a total commodity.
Exactly. But now I want you to imagine the Pentagon, the beating heart of the American military apparatus, buying that exact same ball bearing from a defense contractor.
Okay.
They didn't pay $15.
Let me guess.
They paid $3,357.
Wow.
Yeah. For one single ball bearing.
It just sounds completely absurd on its face, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, how is that even possible?
Well, when you first encounter a figure like that, the immediate assumption is that it has to be a clerical error.
Right, like somebody leaned on the zero key.
Exactly. You assume some procurement officer just accidentally moved a decimal point on a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
But it's not a typo. That price tag is actually, well, it's a feature of a system that operates on a completely different set of structural incentives than, the normal civilian economy you and I interact with every day.
And that is exactly what we're going to dissect today, because the machine that protects us, it really has a logic all its own.
It does.
And frankly, it's a logic that can seem entirely alien to the outside observer. So today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the hidden machinery of the American security state.
And there's a lot to cover.
Oh, there is so much. We're looking at a massive, incredibly dense trove of source material here.
Yeah, thousands of pages.
Exactly. Thousands of pages of declassified documents, exhaustive data visualizations of federal budgets, historical investigative journalism, deep geopolitical analyses.
All of it.
All of it. Our mission today is to trace the actual mechanics of how this sprawling apparatus operates. We're going straight down the rabbit hole.
I'm ready.
We're going to follow the money from the trillions spent by the military-industrial complex out into the shadowy, highly volatile world of global arms dealing.
Which is wild.
It is wild. And then down into the covert black sites operated by the CIA, out to the secret, heavily guarded skies of Area 51, and finally, all the way up into the newest, most fragile battleground in human history.
Outer space.
Outer space.
And before we dive into the ledger, I think it's crucial to establish our framework for this exploration.
Yeah, please do.
Today's deep dive into these sources is not just going to be a chronological list of historical events or like a catalog of military hardware.
Right, we're not just reading a textbook here.
Exactly. We are conducting an investigation into why the system is designed this way and how it actually functions mechanically.
We have to look at the structural foundations.
We do. Because when you understand the underlying mechanisms, the legislative pressures, the geopolitical theories of deterrence, the psychological realities of intelligence gathering, you start to see what this all means for global stability.
Because it affects everything.
It affects everything. Ultimately, we aren't just talking about a $3,000 ball bearing.
Right.
We are talking about the careful, often highly precarious management of the balance of power on Earth.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the sheer, unadulterated scale of this machine.
The budget.
The budget. To understand the behavior of the American security state, we have to talk about the fuel that powers it. The United States currently spends $853 billion annually on defense.
Which is just a massive number.
It is. Now, human brains are not naturally wired to comprehend a number that large.
No, not at all.
I mean, a billion is already an abstraction, let alone 853 of them.
Right.
So let's ground this for you. That single budget is larger than the military spending of the next 10 countries combined.
Wow.
Yeah. It's larger than the entire national economy of Switzerland.
It is insane to think about.
It is a staggering, almost incomprehensible concentration of wealth. But my immediate question when looking at the sources was, well, where is this ocean of capital actually flowing?
It has to go somewhere.
Right. If the country isn't actively engaged in a massive multi-front world war, how do you even manage to spend nearly $1 trillion a year?
That is the fundamental question. And the answer actually challenges a lot of common assumptions.
How so?
Well, when you break down the Pentagon's ledger, the largest single slice of that pie does not go to procuring highly advanced stealth bombers.
Wait, it doesn't?
No, it doesn't go to manufacturing hypersonic missiles either. The largest category accounting for about $352 billion.
Which is roughly the size of the entire economy of Portugal, by the way.
Exactly. That massive chunk goes to a category officially designated as Operations and Maintenance, or O&M.
Okay, O&M.
Yeah. This is the unglamorous, day-to-day, bureaucratic work of keeping a global hegemon fully operational.
I found the details in this category absolutely fascinating because it totally reframes what the military actually is.
It really does.
Because when we think of O&M, we think of jet fuel, transport ships, maybe administrative healthcare costs.
Which it is.
It is those things. But the sources point out that a massive chunk of this capital is dedicated to the maintenance of approximately 1,250 military bases.
Right. And that includes roughly 800 bases located entirely outside of the United States.
800 foreign bases.
Yeah. And the mechanics of operating those foreign installations are incredibly complex and, frankly, very expensive.
Oh, I bet.
Because when the U.S. military establishes a footprint in a foreign country, whether it's in Germany, Japan, South Korea, Djibouti, they don't just clear some dirt and build a concrete barracks.
Right.
They essentially construct a fully functioning, highly insulated slice of American society right in the middle of a foreign landscape.
They are literal mini Americas.
They really are.
The logistical supply chains required to maintain these places are just mind-boggling. The sources detail how the military builds Pizza Huts, Subways, McDonald's right on these bases.
Yeah, the fast food footprint is huge.
They utilize massive cargo fleets to fly in specific American grocery products, familiar brands of cereal and soda.
Just so that an active duty service member stationed thousands of miles away from their family can feel like they haven't entirely left the States.
Right. It's a massive morale and retention strategy.
It is.
But it highlights something profound. The U.S. military isn't just a traditional defensive force tasked with protecting a geographic border.
No, not at all.
It functions as a global policing apparatus, projecting hard power and maintaining a very specific international order.
Exactly.
But the physical logistical cost of maintaining that posture of literally shipping frozen pizza dough to the Horn of Africa is astronomically high.
It is, and the expense extends well beyond the real estate and the supply chains.
What's the next big bucket?
The next massive category in the budget is personnel.
Okay, salaries and stuff?
Yeah, $172 billion is dedicated annually to compensating the 3.4 million active duty soldiers, reservists, and civilian workers.
3.4 million people.
Yes. By multiple economic metrics, the Department of Defense is the single largest employer in the entire world.
The largest in the world. Wow.
And the nature of that workforce is rapidly shifting.
How so? Like away from infantry?
Exactly. We are seeing massive expenditures, not just for infantrymen, but for highly specialized, highly compensated technical talent.
Oh, like tech workers.
Yeah. For example, the sources note a recent initiative where $28 million was spent just on specialized recruitment campaigns.
Just to hire people.
To hire artificial intelligence experts and top-tier software engineers. They are competing directly with Silicon Valley for talent now.
Which provides a perfect transition into the research and development slice of the budget.
R&D.
Yes, R&D. $140 billion.
That's a huge number.
That is the equivalent of the entire gross domestic product of Morocco, poured entirely into conceptualizing and prototyping the future of warfare.
It's wild.
The technology detailed in these sources, it honestly reads like speculative science fiction.
It really does.
We're talking about billions spent on AI architectures designed to autonomously analyze thousands of hours of drone footage searching for targets without human intervention.
Right.
They are funding autonomous, uncrewed submarines that can patrol the ocean floor for months at a time. And then there are the directed energy weapons.
The directed energy programs are particularly illustrative of how this R&D money is utilized.
Yeah.
Yeah, because for decades, the military has been trying to perfect ship-based lasers that can destroy incoming drones or missiles.
But wait, let me stop you there and explain the mechanics of that for a second. Because firing a laser in a vacuum-like space is one thing, but firing a high-powered laser through the Earth's atmosphere, which is full of water vapor, dust, temperature variances, how does that actually work? Doesn't the atmosphere just diffuse the beam before it can melt a target?
You've hit on the exact engineering hurdle that has consumed billions of dollars.
Okay, so I'm on the right track.
You are. The atmosphere causes a phenomenon called thermal blooming.
Thermal blooming.
When you fire a high-energy laser, the beam heats the air it passes through, which actually changes the refractive index of the air, causing the beam to spread out and lose its concentrated power.
So it just kind of fizzes out.
Exactly. So to solve this, the military's R&D sector had to develop adaptive optics.
What's that?
This involves sensors that analyze the atmospheric distortion in real time, literally hundreds of times a second.
Wow.
And it continuously deforms a flexible mirror inside the laser weapon to perfectly counter the distortion.
Wait, really? It bends a mirror to cancel out the atmosphere.
Yes. It allows them to focus millions of watts of energy onto a target the size of a coin, miles away, moving at supersonic speeds, and literally melt the metal midair.
That is insane.
That is what $140 billion buys you, the ability to conquer atmospheric physics.
That is deeply impressive engineering.
It is.
And I think that raises a critical point about this specific bucket of money. It's really easy to look at that $140 billion and view it purely as a mechanism for building more efficient ways to destroy things.
Right, which is the immediate assumption.
But the sources make a really compelling argument that this historical military investment is actually the bedrock of modern civilian life.
Oh, unquestionably. The civilian technological landscape we inhabit is largely a byproduct of defense R&D.
Like GPS.
Right, exactly. The Global Positioning System, GPS, was developed by the Department of Defense to guide nuclear missiles with pinpoint accuracy.
And now we use it to find the nearest Starbucks.
Pretty much. And the foundational architecture of the Internet, ARPANET, was created to ensure military communications could survive a nuclear strike.
Right?
Voice recognition software, the computer mouse, advanced drone technology, even the miniaturization of microchips. All of these were developed, heavily subsidized or accelerated by U.S. military funding.
Okay, so we have the bases, the personnel, and the theoretical research.
Yep.
But I want to talk about the physical hardware, the actual weapons.
Procurement.
Right, that falls under the procurement budget, which is $167 billion.
And this is where the numbers completely detach from everyday reality.
Yeah, the sources highlight the F-35 stealth fighter program.
Oh, boy.
A single F-35 jet costs roughly $142 million to build.
For one jet.
One jet. And the entire program, over its projected lifespan of operations and maintenance, is estimated to cost American taxpayers $2 trillion.
$2 trillion.
It's unfathomable. A single Tomahawk cruise missile costs $1.6 million. And in 1 year alone, the military purchased 600 of them. A Black Hawk helicopter runs about $21 million. The scale of the spending is just relentless.
It is relentless. And, it brings us to a severe structural crisis within this system.
The audits.
Yes. When you have nearly $1 trillion flowing annually through a bureaucracy, this labyrinthine, this deeply compartmentalized, fundamental financial accountability breaks down completely.
Completely.
The Pentagon is the only major federal agency that has never successfully passed an independent financial audit.
I read that and had to double-check the source material. Like, how is that functionally possible?
It's wild.
The sources state that auditors recently found that 61% of the military's physical assets are simply missing.
Missing, yes.
They cannot account for where the equipment is or how the money assigned to those assets was spent.
Right.
If a civilian corporation lost track of 61% of its inventory, the executives would be in federal prison. So is this just sheer incompetence? Or is the DoD deliberately obfuscating their ledger to hide black budget projects?
It's a fair question, but it is actually less about deliberate malicious obfuscation and more about the catastrophic failure of legacy systems.
What do you mean?
Well, the Department of Defense doesn't have one unified accounting system.
Oh, no.
They have hundreds of different deeply antiquated software systems, many dating back to the 1970s and 80s, that literally cannot communicate with one another.
You're kidding.
No, I mean, an asset is logged in an Army system, it gets transferred to a joint command, moved to a forward operating base, and it simply vanishes from the digital ledger because the systems don't talk.
Which means they are highly likely buying brand new replacements for expensive hardware they already own simply because they lost track of it in their own warehouses.
Exactly.
That is a staggering inefficiency, and it brings us to a massive, glaring reality about this budget.
The private sector.
Right. This money is not just circulating internally within the government. 54% of this total budget, that is $466 billion, goes directly to private for-profit corporations.
And this is exactly where we must shift our analytical lens from military strategy to economic reality.
Okay, let's do it.
Over the past 3 decades, the American defense industry has undergone extreme, unprecedented consolidation.
Consolidation meaning companies buying each other.
Yes. If you go back to the early 1990s, right after the Cold War ended, the Pentagon regularly did business with 51 major aerospace and defense prime contractors.
51, okay, so a decent amount.
It was a robust, competitive marketplace.
But today, those 51 companies have been aggressively gobbled up, merged, and acquired until almost everything is controlled by what the sources call the Big Five.
Right.
Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin.
Correct. The competitive marketplace has essentially vanished.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy. It's like playing a game of Monopoly, but over the course of the game, one single player has managed to buy every single property on the entire board.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. If you roll the dice and land anywhere, you have to pay them. And because there are no other options, they can set the rent to absolutely whatever they want.
Exactly.
If the Pentagon determines it desperately needs a fifth-generation stealth fighter, they can't shop around.
No.
There is only one shop in town, Lockheed Martin, that has the infrastructure to build it.
Precisely. And when a private corporation holds a captured market with 0 viable competitors, the fundamental laws of supply and demand are subverted.
And prices go up?
The primary result is skyrocketing costs. The sources cite the example of the Stinger shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile.
Oh yeah, the Stinger.
Decades ago, the government paid roughly $25,000 per unit.
Okay.
Today, for a weapon that performs the exact same function with just some updated internal guidance, they are paying nearly $500,000 per unit.
That is a massive markup.
You cannot attribute that kind of markup solely to inflation or technological upgrades. That is the premium you pay when the seller knows you have nowhere else to go.
But wait, let me challenge this system for a second.
Go for it.
If I am a taxpayer looking at this, I'm furious. Why wouldn't Congress step in? Lawmakers are supposed to be the stewards of the public purse.
You would think so.
Are they just actively corrupt? Because it is very easy to point fingers and scream corporate greed or bribery. But when looking at the sources, it feels like there is a much deeper structural trap at play here.
There is.
How does a lawmaker justify voting for these inflated contracts year after year?
You are hitting on the exact mechanism that sustains the machine.
Okay.
It is not crude bribery. It is a highly sophisticated strategy known as political engineering.
Political engineering, what does that mean?
Well, when a company like Lockheed Martin designs a massive new weapons program like the F-35, they do not just build one massive, highly efficient factory in a single location.
Which would make sense economically.
It would make economic sense, but it makes terrible political sense. Instead, they intentionally fracture the manufacturing supply chain, distributing the production of various components across dozens of states and hundreds of congressional districts.
Oh, wow, I see the trap.
Yeah.
So they mathematically attach domestic jobs to the weapons systems.
Exactly. The sources highlight a prime example involving Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi.
Okay, what did he do?
He sits on a committee tasked with overseeing national security and the naval budget. But simultaneously, the single largest private employer in his home state of Mississippi is a naval shipyard operated by the defense contractor Huntington Ingalls.
Wow. So the incentives are entirely aligned, but it's masked as patriotism.
Right.
When the senator goes to Washington and passionately advocates for a larger naval budget to secure the seas, he is theoretically strengthening the military.
Yes.
But practically, mechanically, he is directly funneling federal tax dollars into securing thousands of high-paying manufacturing jobs in his home state.
Jobs that keep his constituents happy, which ensures he gets reelected.
And then the defense contractors, having secured massive federal payouts, take a fraction of those profits and funnel them back into the political system as campaign donations to the very lawmakers who approve the budget.
It is a perfectly closed-loop ecosystem.
It really is.
Because no representative wants to be the person who stands on the House floor, votes against a defense spending bill on principle, and inadvertently causes a manufacturing plant in their own district to shut down.
Putting 3,000 of their own voters out of work.
Exactly. The system is structurally, legislatively designed to only ratchet upwards. It is almost impossible to dismantle from within.
And if we look even closer at the personnel operating this system, the sources dive into the concept of the revolving door.
Ah, yes. The revolving door.
Because the boundaries between the military top brass, the government oversight committees, and the private corporate boards are incredibly porous.
They are essentially non-existent at the highest levels.
The sources provide the specific trajectory of Jim Mattis as an archetype for this phenomenon.
It's a perfect example.
Because he serves for decades as a highly decorated, widely respected four-star Marine Corps general.
Right.
He retires from active duty, and almost immediately he accepts a highly lucrative position on the corporate board of General Dynamics, one of the big 5 defense contractors.
Right.
Then, a few years later, he is tapped to walk through the revolving door back into government service, becoming the U.S. Secretary of Defense.
The man directly responsible for deciding what weapons the military needs to buy.
Exactly. And when his tenure as secretary ends, where does he go? He walks right back through the door, reclaiming his seat on the board of General Dynamics.
Yep.
Now, I'm not saying there is a literal quid pro quo happening in a smoke-filled room. But when the men making the procurement decisions are the same men profiting from the corporate sales,
the line completely dissolves.
The line between objective national security interests and subjective corporate profit margins just completely dissolves.
The inevitable result of this politically engineered, heavily funded ecosystem is a state of perpetual overproduction.
Overproduction?
Yeah. The system is incredibly efficient at generating capital and producing highly advanced weaponry to satisfy domestic economic and political needs. But here's the critical pivot.
Okay.
The U.S. military, even with its massive global footprint, cannot possibly consume all of the weapons this machine produces.
There's too much of it.
There's too much. To keep the assembly lines moving, to keep the unit costs down, and to keep the corporate profits flowing, these weapons have to go somewhere else.
They must be exported.
Exactly. They must be exported.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is where the narrative shifts from domestic economics to global geopolitics.
It does.
Because when these weapons leave an American factory and are shipped abroad, their fundamental nature transforms. They're no longer just tools designed for war. They become a currency.
A very powerful currency.
They become the primary, tangible mechanism the United States uses to purchase influence and engineer outcomes on the global stage.
To truly grasp the mechanics of the modern international arms trade, the sources take us back to a pivotal historical moment.
Let's hear it.
They reference a highly influential 1934 investigative book titled Merchants of Death.
Ominous title.
It is. This text meticulously details how, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the global arms trade was not controlled by nation-states or foreign policy experts.
Who controlled it?
It was a completely unregulated free market controlled by private businessmen and industrial capitalists.
The history here is absolutely wild. The sources focus on a guy named Hiram Maxim.
Yes.
He is an American-born inventor, a contemporary and rival of Thomas Edison.
Right, working on light bulbs and things.
Yeah, he's working on electrical meters and stuff. But the story goes that a friend tells him, if you want to make real money, invent something that will allow these Europeans to kill each other with greater facility.
Just a chilling piece of advice.
Truly. And so he invents the Maxim gun.
Which fundamentally altered the trajectory of human history.
Right. But explain the actual mechanics of what he invented, because it wasn't just a bigger gun, it was a technological paradigm shift.
It was. Before Maxim, rapid-fire weapons like the Gatling gun existed, but they required a soldier to physically turn a hand crank to load and fire the weapon.
Right, like in the old Westerns.
Exactly, which made them prone to jamming and required constant human exertion. Maxim's genius was harnessing physics.
How so?
He realized that every time a bullet is fired, it creates a massive amount of recoil energy pushing backward.
Yeah.
He designed a mechanism that captured that wasted recoil energy and used it to automatically eject the spent brass casing, pull a new bullet from a woven belt, chamber it, and fire it again in a fraction of a second.
Unbelievable.
It was the first true, fully automatic machine gun. It could fire 666 rounds a minute, completely autonomously, as long as the operator held down the trigger.
It literally industrialized slaughter.
It did.
But Maxim didn't view himself as a harbinger of death. He viewed himself as a salesman with a superior product.
Right, he was a businessman.
He didn't just sell this exclusively to the U.S. or British governments. He went on a global roadshow. He traveled across Europe, setting up demonstrations for the Tsar of Russia, the Kaiser of Germany, the British nobility.
Just showing off the goods.
Yeah. He would chop down massive trees with a hail of bullets just to show off the engineering. He didn't care about the geopolitical ramifications. He cared that the check cleared.
And the consequences were brutal.
They were. The British subsequently used his weapon to absolutely mow down indigenous forces in Africa during their colonial expansion. Maxim got incredibly wealthy.
And Maxim's pure capitalist approach was perfected by a man named Basil Zaharoff,
Basil.
who the press later dubbed this super salesman of death.
Again with the titles.
Yeah, but Zaharoff's tactics perfectly illustrate the inherent systemic danger of a profit-driven arms market. He wasn't just fulfilling demand. He was actively manufacturing paranoia to create demand.
The submarine scheme detailed in the sources is the perfect example of this.
It is. Zaharoff represented a weapons manufacturer that had built early, somewhat outdated steam-powered submarines. No one wanted them.
Okay.
So Zaharoff goes to the government of Greece, he plays on their insecurities, and convinces them to buy a submarine.
Okay, good salesman.
But he doesn't stop there. He immediately travels to Greece's bitter regional rival, the Ottoman Empire, and tells them, look, Greece just acquired a highly advanced underwater weapon. You are completely vulnerable. You need to buy 2 submarines to counter them.
And they buy them.
They buy 2. Then Zaharoff travels to Russia and says, both Greece and Turkey are heavily arming the Black Sea with submarines. You are falling behind.
So Russia buys 2.
Russia buys 2. He deliberately instigated a regional arms race, stoking fear and instability purely to drive his own sales commissions.
It is the ultimate cynical business model.
Truly.
But the macro result of all these brilliant engineers and ruthless businessmen flooding the globe with highly advanced scientific killing machines was the unprecedented mechanized slaughter of World War I. The world woke up after the trenches and the mustard gas and realized that leaving the distribution of weapons of mass destruction entirely in the hands of unregulated private capital was a recipe for global suicide.
Which brings us out of the 1930s and into the modern era.
Right.
Today, the system is highly regulated. Private corporations like Lockheed and Raytheon still design and manufacture the weapons, but they cannot simply sell them to whoever has the cash.
The government has to step in.
The U.S. government, specifically the State Department and Congress, must officially review and approve every single foreign military sale.
Okay, but despite these strict regulations, the United States remains the undisputed top exporter of weapons on the planet.
Selling major arms systems to 103 different sovereign nations.
So I have to ask you to reconcile a massive paradox here.
Okay, let's hear it.
If you read any official State Department press release, the stated goal of U.S. foreign policy is always to promote peace, stability, and democratic values.
Oh, wait.
Yet the primary tangible mechanism they use to achieve that peace is aggressively selling billions of dollars worth of mass killing machines to over 100 different countries. How does the American security state justify that logic?
It is a profound contradiction. And the answer lies deep within the academic theory of international relations, specifically a concept known as the balance of power.
Balance of power, okay.
The operating logic in Washington, heavily influenced by neorealism, is that the international system is anarchic. There is no global police force.
Right.
Therefore, countries will naturally fall into conflict and prey on the weak unless they calculate that a war is utterly unwinnable.
So the strategy is engineered deterrence.
Precisely. The U.S. tries to act as the ultimate calibrator of global scales. They export weapons to arm their allies just enough to deter their regional enemies from launching an attack.
They try to create a security equilibrium.
Yes. But they have to calculate it perfectly because if they give an ally too many weapons, the enemy gets paranoid and starts a preemptive war.
The classic security dilemma.
Exactly.
So the weapons are literally a geopolitical currency. The U.S. isn't just selling hardware, they are buying specific outcomes.
Yes.
They sell fighter jets to NATO allies in Europe to buy a strong, unified, interoperable front against Russia. They sell advanced munitions to Ukraine to bleed a major strategic rival without having to commit American troops to the battlefield.
Right.
They sell missile defense systems to Israel to counter Iranian influence, and they sell massive quantities of arms to countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt to secure American access to vital geostrategic resources like oil reserves and the Suez Canal.
That is the textbook, idealized theory of how the arms trade works.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. provides the steel and the explosive power, and in return, they expect loyalty, regional stability, and strict adherence to American strategic interests. But the sources reveal a glaring flaw in this logic.
What's fascinating here is that the leverage the United States thinks it buys with these weapons is frequently a complete illusion.
Right, because of the blowback.
The blowback is real. The sources are filled with examples of how the strategy backfires. Because no matter how many end-user agreements a country signs, the physical reality is that once those weapons are loaded onto a cargo ship and leave U.S. soil, the U.S. government essentially loses operational control over how they are used.
The most glaring contemporary example documented in our sources is the relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Ah, yes. Let's talk about that.
Over several administrations, the U.S. sold the Saudis billions of dollars in advanced weaponry, including precision-guided munitions, with explicit written stipulations that they could not be used to violate international human rights laws.
Right, there were rules attached.
But Saudi Arabia took those American-made bombs, loaded them onto American-made F-15 fighter jets, and waged a devastating, indiscriminate bombing campaign in neighboring Yemen.
And the targets were not just military installations.
No, they weren't.
Open-source intelligence investigators literally found the physical serial numbers of American defense contractors in the smoldering wreckage of bombed civilian hospitals, bombed weddings, and most famously, a school bus full of children.
It was a massive humanitarian catastrophe, directly facilitated by American hardware.
Now, in a logical system where weapons buy leverage, you would expect the U.S. to immediately utilize that leverage.
Exactly. You'd expect Congress or the president to step in and say, we are immediately halting all weapons, shipments, and maintenance contracts because you are violating the core terms of our agreement and committing war crimes.
Right. But when lawmakers actually attempted to do that, the leverage completely inverted.
It did. Saudi Arabia simply turned around and implicitly threatened, if you cut us off, we will just buy our next generation of fighter jets and missiles from Russia or China. And that threat exposes the fragility of the entire system. The U.S. security state is so deeply terrified of losing Saudi Arabia as a strategic partner in the Middle East, losing access to their airspace, their intelligence sharing, their oil, that they back down.
So the weapons keep flowing.
The weapons keep flowing. The client state, the one ostensibly dependent on American protection, ends up holding the leash.
It proves that weapons are an incredibly volatile, unpredictable currency. And the historical track record of this exact strategy is incredibly grim.
Let's hear it.
The sources take us back to the 1980s, during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
Oh, this is a classic example.
The CIA decided to funnel massive amounts of advanced weaponry, including those Stinger anti-aircraft missiles we talked about earlier, to the Mujahideen rebel fighters to bleed the Soviet army.
In the short term, looking purely through a Cold War lens, the strategy was highly successful.
Yeah, the Stingers destroyed Soviet Hind helicopters, making the occupation untenable, and the Soviets eventually withdrew.
But explain how that blowback actually physically manifests. Because a Stinger missile doesn't just disappear when the war ends.
Exactly. When you pump thousands of untraceable weapons into a fractured, war-torn region, a secondary black market inevitably forms.
Right.
The CIA had no mechanism to track or retrieve the weapons they handed out. So decades later, when the geopolitical winds shifted and the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, they found themselves facing an insurgency armed with the exact same weapons. Utilizing the exact same subterranean smuggling networks that the U.S. had built and funded 20 years prior.
You try to buy short-term stability, and you end up actively funding and arming the next generation of chaos.
It's tragic. The sources note similar lethal leaks occurring in Libya, where weapons meant for rebels flooded into the hands of extremists across the Sahel, in Syria, and in South Sudan.
So we arrive at a critical juncture in the logic of the security state.
Where do we go from here?
Well, if throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at domestic defense contractors doesn't perfectly secure the homeland, and if utilizing weapons as a global currency repeatedly backfires and creates new enemies, what does the state do next? When massive public displays of economic and military force fail to bend the world to its will, the state turns away from the light. It turns to the shadows.
The covert apparatus.
It begins to rely on a deeply entrenched, highly covert apparatus.
We are talking, of course, about the intelligence community. The network of agencies, often colloquially and sometimes conspiratorially referred to as the deep state.
Right.
To understand how this covert machinery operates today, the sources insist we have to trace its exact origins.
Because it didn't always exist.
Right. During World War II, the U.S. realized it was severely lagging in espionage, so they created the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, under a man named Wild Bill Donovan.
The OSS was designed from its inception to be a temporary wartime-only agency.
Oh, really? Just for the war?
Yeah. Because they were fighting the existential threat of Nazi Germany, Donovan's agents were given immense, almost unchecked latitude to operate behind enemy lines. They specialized in sabotage, psychological warfare, deception, targeted assassinations.
But when World War II ended, President Harry Truman did something that seems almost unthinkable today. He completely dismantled the intelligence apparatus.
He did.
He looked at the immense secret power the OSS had accumulated and was genuinely terrified of what that meant for a peacetime democracy.
He explicitly stated in internal memos that he did not want to accidentally create an American Gestapo.
Wow.
He understood the inherent corrosive danger of allowing unelected officials to hold secret power and operate outside the bounds of public accountability.
Truman's instincts were entirely rooted in democratic principles. However, the immediate dawn of the Cold War, the descent of the Iron Curtain across Europe, and the realization that the Soviet Union was building a massive nuclear arsenal, it forced his hand.
The geopolitical reality demanded espionage.
So, in 1947, Truman ultimately signed the National Security Act, which officially gave birth to the Central Intelligence Agency.
But they didn't just invent a new agency from scratch.
No, they didn't. They pulled in all the old OSS operatives.
Exactly. So the wartime culture, the belief that the ends always justify the means, that laws are merely suggestions when survival is on the line, was baked right into the CIA's DNA from day one.
And the demographics of this new agency were highly specific. The sources paint a vivid picture of the power concentration.
Tell me about it.
You had figures like Allen Dulles, who would become the director of the CIA, and William Colby. These were Ivy League, educated, wealthy, elite men who all lived within blocks of each other in the highly affluent Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C.
The geographic and social concentration is vital to understand.
Right, it was an insular group.
These men attended the same exclusive cocktail parties, their children went to the same private schools, they shared the exact same patrician worldview. They created an echo chamber.
And because their work was highly classified, they were completely insulated from congressional oversight or public criticism.
Yes. They were making law-for-death decisions that would alter the fate of millions of people in the developing world, all from the comfort of a Georgetown drawing room.
And what followed over the next 2 decades was essentially a covert, global crime spree.
It's hard to describe it any other way.
Operating with incredibly vague mandates and absolutely zero real oversight, the CIA just went rogue. The history of the 1950s through the 1970s, detailed in these sources, reads like a dystopian thriller.
It does.
In 1953, they orchestrated Operation Ajax, overthrowing the democratically elected prime minister of Iran because he wanted to nationalize the country's oil reserves.
A year later, they executed a coup in Guatemala.
And the Guatemala coup is deeply illustrative of how corporate interests bleed into intelligence work.
So,
the CIA overthrew the Guatemalan government largely at the behest of the United Fruit Company.
an American corporation.
Yeah, an American corporation that owned massive tracts of land in Guatemala and felt their profit margins were threatened by the new government's land reform policies.
Here's the kicker. Allen Dulles, the CIA director, had previously served on the board of trustees for the law firm that represented United Fruit.
The conflicts of interest are just staggering. They were involved in assassinations and coups in the Congo, in Chile, in Vietnam.
But their operations weren't strictly foreign.
No. The sources detail how they frequently turned their immense covert power inward, targeting the American populace.
Operation Mockingbird is a prime example.
What was that?
The CIA systematically infiltrated the American press, secretly placing agents in major newsrooms and paying off respected journalists to publish agency-approved propaganda, actively shaping domestic public opinion without the public's knowledge.
And then there is MKUltra.
Ah, MKUltra.
Which sounds like internet conspiracy theory, but is exhaustively documented historical fact. The CIA was terrified that the Soviets had developed mind control techniques, so they authorized a program to develop their own truth serum.
And how did they do it?
They secretly dosed hundreds of unwitting American citizens, including hospital patients, prisoners, and even their own employees, with massive amounts of LSD, subjecting them to psychological torture just to observe the effects.
It's horrifying. They also ran Operation Chaos, where they utilized their surveillance apparatus to illegally spy on the domestic civil rights and anti-war movements, attempting to discredit leaders they viewed as subversive.
But of all the historical documents included in the source material, there is one that absolutely stopped me in my tracks.
Which one?
It is a declassified memo from 1962 called Operation Northwoods.
Oh, Northwoods.
And I want to be very clear here for you listening.
Yeah.
This was not some rogue, low-level field agent spitballing crazy ideas in a basement. This was a formal, heavily vetted proposal drafted and unanimously signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the United States Armed Forces.
To understand the Northwoods document, you have to understand the sheer blinding paranoia of the early 1960s.
Paint the picture.
The Cuban Revolution had just occurred. Fidel Castro had allied with the Soviet Union, placing a communist stronghold just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The Joint Chiefs viewed this as a literal existential threat to the survival of the United States. They were desperate to launch a full-scale military invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro.
But they knew the international community and the American public would not support an unprovoked war.
Exactly. They needed a casus belli justification.
So their solution, presented in writing to the Secretary of Defense, was to stage a series of highly elaborate, incredibly violent false flag operations against their own country.
The mechanics of the proposal are chilling.
Give me an example.
The Joint Chiefs explicitly suggested blowing up a U.S. military ship in Guantanamo Bay and staging funerals for the fake victim.
Fake victims.
Yes. They proposed orchestrating a campaign of terrorism in U.S. cities, literally suggesting they detonate plastic explosives in Miami and Washington, D.C., arresting Cuban agents they themselves had planted.
But the most elaborate plan involved a civilian airliner.
Oh, yeah.
Explain how they intended to pull that off, because the sheer logistical sociopathy required is mind-bending.
The document outlines a plan to charter a civilian airliner filled with college students flying over the Caribbean.
Okay.
They would secretly swap that plane mid-air with an exact unmanned drone replica. The real plane with the students would land secretly at a military base, while the drone would continue on the flight path.
And then what?
They would then broadcast a fake distress signal claiming the plane was under attack by Cuban MiG fighters, remotely detonate the drone over the ocean, and point to the wreckage as absolute proof that Castro had murdered American civilians.
They were literally proposing to orchestrate mass terror against the American public, to manipulate the populace into a state of blind rage solely to manufacture consent for a geopolitical war.
It's hard to believe it was real, but it is.
Now, thankfully, President John F. Kennedy read this memo, was utterly horrified, and immediately rejected the plan.
Thank goodness.
It never went beyond the planning phase. But the terrifying takeaway is not that it didn't happen. The takeaway is that the architecture of the security state produced that document.
Yes, that is the real lesson.
The men tasked with protecting the nation viewed the American public as entirely expendable pawns.
It shows you what happens when an intelligence apparatus operates in total secrecy. It's like a high-performance engine running without a governor.
Eventually, it just rips itself apart.
Eventually, the RPMs get so high, the paranoia gets so deep, that it threatens to violently shake the entire democratic vehicle apart.
The abuses of that era were eventually dragged into the light by the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s.
Right, which led to significant legal reforms and the establishment of congressional intelligence committees.
But the fundamental underlying tension, the clash between the rule of law and the primal imperative for security, never truly went away. It just lay dormant.
And that tension violently, explosively snapped back into focus on the morning of September 11, 2001.
9/11 completely reset the rules of the game. If you look at the source material regarding the immediate aftermath, the anger and the raw terror radiating from Washington were palpable.
The CIA was essentially handed a blank check by the executive branch and told to do absolutely whatever it took to ensure a second wave of attacks didn't happen.
But the CIA faced a massive legal hurdle.
They did. They believed they needed to capture suspected al-Qaeda operatives and interrogate them ruthlessly to uncover ticking time bombs.
Right.
However, they knew that if they arrested these men and brought them to American soil, the U.S. Constitution would immediately apply.
Which means lawyers.
The suspects would be entitled to legal representation, they would have the right to remain silent, they would face public trials, and the U.S. would be bound by the Geneva Conventions prohibiting torture.
And the intelligence community definitively did not want those rules. They wanted raw, unfiltered, immediate intelligence, and they believed that physical and psychological violence was the only mechanism to extract it.
So they realized they couldn't operate within the bounds of U.S. law.
Which directly birthed the creation of the black sites?
Yes. The CIA systematically constructed a covert, global network of secret prisons across 54 different cooperating countries.
They chose locations specifically outside the jurisdiction of the U.S. justice system and the international courts.
The sheer logistical complexity of disappearing a human being off the face of the earth is staggering.
The sources provide a highly detailed account of the capture of a man named Abu Zubaydah, who the CIA incorrectly believed was a top-tier al-Qaeda mastermind.
They capture him in Pakistan, and they secretly fly him to a black site in Thailand.
It is there that they first subject him to extreme torture, a process that government lawyers cynically sanitized with the bureaucratic term enhanced interrogation techniques.
But eventually, the Thai government started getting nervous.
Right. They didn't want the heat.
Rumors were leaking to the press, and Thailand didn't want the international fallout of hosting a torture facility. So the CIA had to move him, and they had to do it completely invisibly.
Right. They didn't just put him on a military transport. They utilized a network of shell companies to lease a private Gulfstream jet to make it look like a corporate executive flight.
They filed entirely fake flight records with international aviation authorities, claiming the plane was destined for a routine stop in Vienna, Austria.
But mid-flight, the plane diverted and landed at a tiny, highly isolated rural airstrip in the middle of Poland.
The financial transactions behind this are incredibly crude for a sophisticated intelligence agency.
How do they pay for it?
The CIA literally paid the Polish intelligence service $15 million in physical, sequential $100 bills delivered in massive cardboard boxes.
Cardboard boxes of cash.
Simply to secure the use of a remote military facility in a Polish forest, which the CIA designated Detention Site Blue.
And Poland was just one node. The sources detail another black site located near Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan that was literally referred to as the Dark Prison.
The conditions there were designed for total psychological destruction. Prisoners were kept in metal shipping containers. There were no windows, no lights.
Just darkness.
It was total pitch-black sensory deprivation, punctuated by heavy metal music blasted at deafening volumes for days on end to prevent sleep. In total, the CIA cycled 119 prisoners through this nightmare network of black sites over several years.
But here's a statistic that genuinely shocked me in the reading. Out of those 119 men whose lives were completely dismantled, 94 of them were eventually released without charge.
Yeah, 94.
The CIA realized after months or years of imprisonment that they had simply abducted the wrong person based on faulty intelligence or mistaken identity.
Now, as an analyst, I know the exact pushback that a segment of the public will have when hearing this history.
Absolutely. What is it?
They will argue the context of the era. They will say, right after 9/11, the threat was existential. Didn't the American public implicitly want the government to take the gloves off and be ruthless?
Right. Weren't these CIA agents acting out of a genuine, if perhaps misguided, sense of deep patriotism to prevent another mass casualty event?
That is the ultimate ethical and strategic question. Does a ticking time bomb justify abandoning the rule of law? Does the end justify the means if you genuinely believe thousands of lives are at stake?
To answer that, we have to look past the emotion and objectively evaluate the results, which were exhaustively analyzed and documented in the Senate Intelligence Committee's multi-year report on the torture program.
And what did the committee conclude?
The committee, having access to millions of pages of highly classified internal CIA cables, concluded unequivocally that the torture program was a complete and utter failure.
A failure.
It produced no unique plot-thwarting intelligence that wasn't already available through standard legal interrogation methods.
And this is where the why becomes so important. Why didn't it work? Why doesn't physical agony produce truth?
It comes down to basic human neurobiology and psychology.
Right. When you subject a human being to extreme, sustained, trauma-like waterboarding where the body is biologically convinced it is drowning, the brain enters a state of primal panic.
The amygdala hijacks the system.
Exactly. The higher cognitive functions in the prefrontal cortex, which are responsible for logical memory recall, shut down. The victim's sole, overriding biological imperative becomes stopping the immediate pain.
Which means they will say absolutely anything to make it stop.
In anything.
The sources detail how Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the actual architect of the 9/11 attacks, was waterboarded an astonishing 183 times.
And what was the result?
He didn't break down and reveal the location of hidden operatives. He simply realized he could manipulate the interrogators.
Right.
He started inventing wildly elaborate, entirely fictional terrorist plots, assassinations, dirty bombs, attacks on banks, and feeding them to the CIA, purely because he knew providing intel would temporarily halt the drowning sensation.
He sent the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus on massive, multi-million-dollar wild goose chases while providing zero actionable truth.
And this represents the profound, overarching tragedy of the Black Site program. By engaging in systematic torture, the CIA fell directly into al-Qaeda's strategic trap. The primary goal of a terrorist organization is rarely to defeat a superpower militarily. That is impossible. The goal is provocation.
Right, to get a reaction.
The goal is to induce a massive overreaction that forces the superpower to violate its own core values, thereby discrediting its moral authority on the global stage.
By abandoning human rights, due process, and the rule of law, the United States surrendered the moral high ground.
It totally tainted the pursuit of actual justice. The men who actually planned the 9/11 attacks are currently sitting in prison at Guantanamo Bay.
But for over 2 decades, the government has struggled to try them in a legitimate court of law.
Because almost all of the evidence gathered against them was obtained through illegal torture, making it entirely inadmissible.
In a stunning twist of irony, the sources note that one of the masterminds of the USS Cole bombing actually sued in the European Court of Human Rights.
And one, right.
He received a financial victim payout from the European governments that hosted the black sites because of what the CIA did to him.
It is a staggering, multi-generational strategic failure.
The intelligence state, in its relentless, unchecked pursuit of absolute security, eventually realized a fundamental limitation.
What's that?
Having secret laws interpreted by secret courts and utilizing secret flights on leased jets wasn't quite enough to operate freely. They needed secret geography.
Secret geography. I like that phrase.
They needed a physical space within the United States that was so remote, so heavily fortified, and so legally isolated that the public eye simply could not penetrate it.
Which brings us directly out of the freezing forests of Poland and into the searing, blinding heat of the Nevada desert. We have to talk about Area 51.
Area 51.
Now, if you walk out onto the street and ask the average person what Area 51 is, they're going to tell you without hesitation that it is the place where the government keeps the crashed UFOs and studies extraterrestrial biology.
Of course, that's the myth.
But the source material reveals that the real documented history of this facility is arguably far more fascinating than the sci-fi mythology, and it serves as an absolute masterclass in how the military weaponizes the psychology of secrecy.
The actual origin of Area 51 is deeply pragmatic and rooted entirely in Cold War physics.
Physics, not aliens.
Exactly. In the mid-1950s, the CIA had a massive intelligence blind spot. Soviet Union was a closed society, and the U.S. desperately needed to know how many nuclear bombers and missile silos they were building.
But they couldn't just fly a plane over Moscow. The Soviets had highly advanced radar networks and surface-to-air missiles that would shoot them down instantly.
So the CIA's engineering solution was to build a surveillance aircraft that flew so incredibly high, upwards of 70,000 feet, which is essentially the very edge of the stratosphere where the sky turns black, that it was physically invisible to Soviet radar and completely untouchable by their missiles.
That aircraft was the U-2 spy plane.
But developing a plane that can fly in air that thin requires massive, fragile wings and highly experimental engines that are prone to flaming out.
They couldn't just test a top-secret, highly dangerous spy plane at a bustling public Air Force base in California or Ohio.
Too many eyes.
Right. They needed a massive, completely empty, highly restricted expanse of land. They surveyed the American West and found Groom Lake, a dried-out, flat salt, flat deep in the Nevada desert, surrounded by mountains. Thus, Area 51 was born.
And it served its purpose perfectly until 1960, when the Soviets upgraded their missile technology and managed to shoot down a U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers.
Right.
The CIA realized that sheer altitude was no longer a sufficient defense. They had to pivot their entire engineering paradigm. If they couldn't fly above the radar, they had to figure out how to defeat the radar itself.
Which led to the development of stealth technology. And this is where the physical design of the aircraft they were testing at Area 51 became incredibly bizarre.
It really did.
Explain how radar actually works and why these new planes look so strange, because it's vital to understanding the UFO sightings.
Traditional radar works by sending out a burst of radio waves. When those waves hit a solid object in the sky, like the curved cylindrical fuselage of a standard airplane, the waves bounce directly back to the radar receiver, creating a blip on a screen.
The larger the plane, the bigger the radar cross-section, and the larger the blip.
Exactly. So how do you make a plane invisible?
You change the geometry.
Yes. The engineers at Lockheed Skunk Works realized that if they built an airplane not with smooth aerodynamic curves, but with completely flat, highly faceted, jagged surfaces, the incoming radar waves wouldn't bounce back to the receiver.
Ah.
Instead, the flat angles would scatter the radio waves in 1,000 different random directions into the atmosphere. The radar receiver gets nothing back, and the plane is effectively invisible.
But the resulting aircraft, like the F-117A Nighthawk, looked absolutely nothing like a traditional plane. It looked like a dark, jagged, flying wedge.
It was incredibly unaerodynamic. Pilots joked it flew like a brick, but it defeated the radar.
They tested these designs at Area 51 by building full-scale models, hoisting them upside down on massive poles in the desert, and blasting them with radio waves to measure the scattering effect.
So now put yourself in the shoes of a civilian living in Nevada in the 1960s or 70s, or a commercial airline pilot flying a red-eye across the desert.
Right. You look out your window and you see an aircraft flying at 70,000 feet, glowing in the high-altitude sun, which is twice as high as any commercial jet is capable of flying.
Or you see a completely silent, dark, sharply angled, wedge-shaped craft moving across the sky at Mach 3.
You have absolutely no concept of stealth technology or radar cross-sections. What does your brain tell you that you just saw? You report a UFO.
The declassified CIA internal documents from this era are incredibly revealing.
What do they say?
They explicitly acknowledge that during the peak testing periods of the U-2 and the early stealth aircraft, over half of all UFO sightings reported in the United States were actually just civilians spotting their highly classified test flights.
So the intelligence community knows their top-secret aviation projects are causing a nationwide UFO hysteria. Did they issue a press release saying, hey, everyone, don't panic, it's just experimental military technology, nothing to worry about?
Absolutely not. They realize that this organic hysteria is the greatest gift they could possibly receive.
They viewed the UFO narrative as a massive, entirely free bonus to their operational security. It was the perfect psychological cover story.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that psyop, because they didn't just sit back and laugh about it. They actively leaned in and manipulated the public.
They did.
As long as the civilian populace, and more importantly, Soviet spies monitoring American media, were obsessing over the idea of extraterrestrials and flying saucers in Nevada, they weren't looking for the truth. Highly classified, radar-defeating stealth bombers.
The military actively utilized disinformation. They would monitor UFO enthusiast groups, sometimes feeding them fake, heavily redacted documents to keep them chasing ghosts.
The sources even detail instances where security personnel at Area 51 would intentionally put on strange, synchronized light shows at night, shining massive beams into the sky, purely to test the public's reaction and further muddy the waters of truth.
They turned the American public into unwitting guinea pigs in a massive sociological experiment on perception management.
And that psychological experiment reached its absolute zenith in 1989.
With Bob Lazar.
The sources bring up this man named Bob Lazar. He goes on a local Las Vegas television news broadcast, his face hidden in shadow, and makes an explosive claim.
He states that he is a physicist who was hired to work at a highly classified underground facility just south of Area 51 called S4.
And he claims that his specific job was to reverse engineer the propulsion systems of 9 actual extraterrestrial flying discs recovered by the military.
Whether Lazar was a complete fraud seeking attention or a low-level contractor who was deliberately fed disinformation by the intelligence community as a test, the result was the same.
That single television interview essentially birthed the entire modern pop culture mythology of Area 51.
To this day, millions of people genuinely deeply believe the government is hiding alien bodies and spacecraft out in that desert.
But the profound reality, documented in the source material, is that the military is simply hiding highly advanced human engineering.
This history perfectly illustrates a concept we can call the paradox of secrecy.
How so?
We live in a dangerous competitive world, and a nation absolutely requires secrecy to develop advanced technologies to defend itself from adversaries. But in an open, democratic society, prolonged, absolute institutional secrecy inevitably breeds a deep, festering mistrust of the government.
Because nature abhors a vacuum. When the government refuses to provide the truth, The human mind will invent a narrative to fill the void.
Mistrust curdles into suspicion, and suspicion crystallizes into wild, unshakable belief.
Area 51 acts as this massive, dusty magic mirror sitting out in the desert. People drive up to that chain-link fence, stare out at the restricted mountains, and they project their own internal worldview onto the blank canvas of the base.
The staunch patriot sees brilliant engineers working tirelessly to keep the country safe. The paranoid conspiracy theorist sees a malevolent deep state plotting global control. The dreamer sees visitors from another star system.
But the truth is entirely terrestrial. It is simply a highly effective, incredibly secretive military testing ground.
Area 51 was born because we needed to look down at our enemies from the highest possible altitude. But the atmosphere wasn't high enough. Now, the ultimate high ground is space.
The ultimate high ground.
Which takes us to our final destination on this incredibly deep dive.
When most people look up at the night sky, they think of space as this pristine, silent, peaceful void, a realm for science and exploration.
But the geopolitical reality is that low Earth orbit is incredibly congested, highly contested, and it is rapidly becoming heavily militarized.
The United States military has officially, legally designated space as a warfighting domain, treating it conceptually no differently than land, the sea, or the air.
And the reason for that designation is pure reliance. There are currently over 12,000 active satellites orbiting the Earth right now.
12,000.
And the military relies on that network for absolutely everything they do. The sources describe satellites as the central nervous system of modern warfare.
That is an accurate analogy. Without satellites, the modern military is deaf, blind, and functionally paralyzed.
Let's break down exactly what these machines are doing. We all use GPS on our phones to navigate traffic. But the military uses the Global Positioning System for precision strike capabilities.
A Tomahawk cruise missile requires constant updates from a constellation of satellites to adjust its flight path and hit a specific window of a specific building from 1,000 miles away.
Furthermore, the GPS satellites broadcast highly precise timing signals that synchronize the encrypted communications networks of troops on the ground.
Satellites use synthetic aperture radar-bouncing microwave radiation off the Earth to peer through thick cloud cover and map the movements of enemy armor or discover underground bunkers.
And crucially, a network of highly sensitive infrared satellites operates as the ultimate early warning system, constantly scanning the globe, looking for the massive heat bloom that signifies the launch of a nuclear intercontinental ballistic missile.
Because these satellites are absolutely vital to the survival and functionality of the state, they are also the ultimate prime targets for adversaries.
And the war in space isn't some hypothetical sci-fi scenario reserved for the future. It is actively happening right now, every single day, primarily through what is known as non-kinetic warfare.
Let's explain the mechanics of that, because we aren't seeing X-wings firing lasers and blowing things up into fireballs.
Right. Non-kinetic means you are attacking the asset without physically breaking it.
Correct. The most common form of this is jamming. A satellite is essentially just a highly sophisticated radio receiver and transmitter.
Okay.
If an adversary on the ground aims a massive, high-powered terrestrial antenna at an American communications satellite and blasts a blast of loud, meaningless radio noise on the exact same frequency the satellite uses, the satellite is overwhelmed.
It's like trying to listen to someone whispering across a room while someone else is screaming directly into your ear with a megaphone. The signal is lost.
And then there is spoofing, which is far more insidious.
Spoofing doesn't drown out the signal, it replaces it.
An adversary broadcasts a fake, slightly stronger GPS signal up to a satellite or down to a receiver. The receiver locks onto the fake signal without realizing it.
You can subtly alter the navigational coordinates, tricking an enemy drone or a ship into thinking it is miles away from its actual location, guiding it directly into a trap or causing it to crash.
And beyond manipulating the radio waves, there are flat-out cyber attacks.
The sources highlight a critical event that occurred right before Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
The Ukrainian military heavily relied on commercial satellites, operated by a company called Viasat, for their secure internet and troop communications.
Hours before the tanks rolled across the border, Russian state hackers executed a highly sophisticated cyber attack, flooding the Viasat network with malicious code.
They successfully bricked thousands of satellite modems on the ground. They literally blinded and silenced the Ukrainian military command in the opening hours of a ground war, all through a digital attack routed through space.
Non-kinetic attacks are the preferred method of conflict right now because they offer deniability, they are often reversible, And most importantly, they do not create physical debris.
But the major geopolitical powers, the United States, China, and Russia, are not stopping at cyber warfare. They are aggressively developing and testing kinetic weapons.
Weapons explicitly designed to physically smash and destroy other satellites in orbit.
And this is where the physics of space make everything terrifyingly precarious. Over the past decade, we've seen countries like Russia, China, and India launch missiles from the ground specifically to blow up their own dead satellites, just as a show of force to prove to the world that they have the capability.
But when you detonate an explosive in low Earth orbit, the result is catastrophic.
It creates a massive, expanding cloud of jagged metal shrapnel.
And because there is no air resistance in space, that debris doesn't slow down.
It travels at orbital velocities, roughly 17,000 miles per hour.
At that speed, a piece of shrapnel the size of a paint fleck carries the kinetic energy of a bowling ball dropped from a skyscraper.
It can easily punch a hole straight through the hull of an active billion-dollar communications satellite or the International Space Station.
This leads to the concept of Kessler syndrome, right?
Exactly. If a kinetic war breaks out and multiple satellites are destroyed, the resulting debris fields could slam into other satellites, creating a runaway chain reaction of destruction.
It could mathematically render low Earth orbit completely unusable for generations, essentially trapping humanity on the surface of the planet.
Knowing that blowing things up creates a suicidal debris field, the militaries have had to get more creative.
Which leads to the development of co-orbital weapons.
The sources highlight a specific Chinese satellite, designated the SJ-21. It was ostensibly launched with the stated peaceful purpose of testing technologies to clean up space junk.
But the Pentagon watched very closely what the SJ-21 actually did.
In 2022, it performed a highly complex, autonomous orbital maneuver. It approached a dead Chinese navigation satellite, matched its speed perfectly, reached out with a robotic grappling arm, physically grabbed the dead satellite, fired its thrusters, and dragged the dead satellite hundreds of miles out into a higher graveyard orbit before releasing it.
The engineering required to do that autonomously is staggering, but the military application is obvious.
The Pentagon watched this maneuver and openly referred to it as dogfighting in space.
Because the logic is simple. If you have the technology to gently grapple a dead satellite and move it, you possess the exact technology required to grapple an active, multi-billion-dollar American spy satellite, crush its solar panels, and throw it out of orbit.
It is a dual-use technology. A garbage truck in space is also a weapon.
And the U.S. is actively engaged in this dance as well. The sources point out that Russian inspector satellites have been caught repeatedly tailing U.S. spy satellites, creeping dangerously close to intercept their signals.
Meanwhile, the U.S. military operates its own highly secretive, uncrewed space plane, the X-37B, which has spent thousands of cumulative days in orbit, maneuvering unpredictably, reportedly testing classified technologies like space-based high-powered microwaves and lasers that could be used to blind the optical sensors of enemy satellites without creating a debris field.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the most existential threat detailed in the sources brings us back to the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. We have to talk about the nuclear threat in space.
During the height of the Cold War, before we fully understood the physics of the upper atmosphere, both the U.S. and the Soviets tested detonating nuclear weapons in space. The U.S. operation was called Starfish Prime.
Now, explain the mechanics of a space nuke, because there is no atmosphere in space. You don't get a giant fireball or a massive shockwave of air pressure knocking down buildings like you do on Earth.
Right.
So what does a nuke actually do in a vacuum?
The danger is not the blast wave. The danger is the radiation. When a nuclear weapon detonates in the vacuum of space, it releases a massive, unimpeded burst of gamma rays.
When those gamma rays travel downward and strike the thin upper edges of the Earth's atmosphere, they interact with the air molecules, forcefully knocking electrons out of their orbits.
Creating a massive electromagnetic pulse.
An EMP.
Precisely. Those liberated electrons are trapped by the Earth's magnetic field, creating a massive, localized electrical current in the upper atmosphere. This pulse induces massive surges of electricity in any unshielded electronic equipment within its line of sight.
When Starfish Prime detonated, it instantly fried the delicate circuitry of roughly 1/3 of all the satellites in low Earth orbit at the time.
It also blew out streetlights and telephone networks on the ground in Hawaii, nearly 1,000 miles away.
Once the superpowers realized that a space nuke was essentially a suicide pact that destroyed their own assets alongside their enemies, they rushed to the UN and signed the Outer Space Treaty, explicitly banning the placement of weapons of mass destruction in orbit.
But today, that consensus is deeply fraying.
Recently, the United States proposed a UN resolution simply to reaffirm that 1967 treaty and officially ban nuclear weapons in space once again.
Russia vetoed the resolution, leading to a massive diplomatic standoff. And shortly after, U.S. intelligence agencies publicly leaked their assessment that Russia may be actively developing a new space-based nuclear anti-satellite weapon.
The logic being that if Russia is losing a conventional war on the ground, they could threaten to detonate a nuke in orbit, wiping out the entire U.S. satellite network in a fraction of a second, completely leveling the technological playing field.
And in response to these escalating threats, we are seeing the revival of massive Cold War-era defense concepts.
Yes. Back in the 1980s, under Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, derisively called Star Wars, there was a theoretical program known as Brilliant Pebbles.
The plan was to put a massive swarm of thousands of small, autonomous interceptor satellites into orbit. If the Soviets launched nuclear missiles, these satellites would detect the launch, calculate the intercept trajectories, and physically ram into the missiles in the vacuum of space, destroying them before they could re-enter the atmosphere.
At the time, the technology was too primitive and the cost of launching thousands of satellites was economically impossible.
But today, it isn't. The sources indicate this exact concept is currently being heavily revived by the Pentagon under the moniker the Golden Dome.
And they are able to do this entirely because of the private sector. The cheap, reusable rocket launch capabilities pioneered by commercial companies like Elon Musk's SpaceX have completely altered the economics of space.
The military can now afford to launch massive constellations of sensor satellites and interceptors to build a literal, physical missile shield in orbit.
This raises an important question. Are we actually going to see Star Wars-style lasers blowing things up, or is this mostly just countries flexing their tech muscles to scare each other?
The overarching risk of all this militarization is immense. We are currently operating in a Wild West environment, heavily reliant on vastly outdated treaties written before the microchip was even invented.
A kinetic war in space wouldn't just be a localized military disaster.
If a nation detonates a nuke, or causes a Kessler syndrome cascade of debris that shreds the major satellite networks, the collateral damage on Earth would be apocalyptic.
It would instantly wipe out the global GPS network, meaning commercial airplanes couldn't navigate, and the automated timing systems that synchronize the global stock exchanges and banking systems would fail.
International communications would go dark. The internet backbone would be severely degraded.
Modern civilization is quite literally hanging by a thread, orbiting blindly 400 kilometers above our heads at 17,000 miles per hour.
It is a profound shared vulnerability that connects every single person on the planet, whether they realize it or not.
And that shared vulnerability brings us full circle on this massive journey we've taken you on today. We started by looking at a mundane spreadsheet, examining a $142 million fighter jet and a highly inflated $3,000 ball bearing.
But we uncovered the mechanics of a domestic economic system that is structurally built on a permanent war footing.
We traced how those weapons inevitably flow overseas, becoming the volatile currency of global geopolitical influence, often resulting in devastating blowback on the very hands that dealt them.
We ventured into the darkest, most secretive corners of the deep state, analyzing the psychological and structural failures of covert CIA black sites and the tragic reality that torture destroys the truth.
We saw how that exact same veil of state secrecy was ingeniously weaponized at Area 51, actively manipulating the American public into seeing extraterrestrials instead of advanced stealth bombers.
And finally, we looked up past the atmosphere to the silent, invisible, and incredibly fragile battlefield orbiting directly above us.
It is a vast, interconnected machine. And it is a machine that relies on immense capital, impenetrable secrecy, and the maintenance of a constant, low-level state of global tension to sustain itself.
But what is truly concerning as we look to the future is the velocity of this system. As technology accelerates, the sheer speed at which this machine operates is rapidly slipping beyond the capacity of human cognition to manage.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought to chew on long after we wrap up here. The military is currently pouring billions of dollars into artificial intelligence, training massive neural networks to analyze all that orbital satellite data and optimize drone targeting protocols.
But as this silent war in space accelerates, an arena where a defensive decision to grapple an incoming enemy satellite or fire a countermeasure laser has to be calculated and executed in fractions of a second while objects are traveling at Mach 24. Humans are simply too slow.
The biological brain cannot process the physics fast enough, so inevitably we will remove ourselves from the loop. We will delegate the authority to pull the trigger to the machine.
What happens then to the concept of the deep state and the balance of global power, when the ultimate secretive authority isn't held by unelected men drinking cocktails in a Georgetown drawing room, but by an autonomous, self-learning algorithm orbiting in the cold vacuum of space, calculating the mathematical odds of Armageddon entirely on its own?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.